On today's podcast, I'm talking with Charlotte, a yoga psychologist. Hi, Charlotte.
Hi, Danny.
So can you just tell us a bit about your background? Because I know you've done quite a lot of different things, from yoga teaching, psychology, and now Ayurveda. So yeah, tell us more.
With pleasure. So originally my training, university training, is in clinical psychology. And a few years back, I was working actually not as a psychologist, but in the field of recruitment more. And I was more in like the HR kind of part of psychology for several years. And then I decided to kind of just leave the corporate world and to change lives, actually. And that's when I became a yoga teacher. And so I became a yoga teacher, and quite early on in my teachings, I connected quickly, actually, my field of psychology to the yoga practice, especially through the students that I was working with. Because when you practice, especially regularly, there's all these stuff that comes up. And I started to link some of the specific emotional things to some of the specific practices. Now, for many years, I was just then teaching yoga and then using my psychology knowledge in this. And that's kind of when I came up with this name of yoga psychology, because we would really implement that, and we would kind of base ourselves on the yogic perspective of psychology, which is the subtle body, which is also spoken of the pranic body or the energy body. And that's where we tap into the chakra system. So that was very much related to the way I was working on both psychology and yoga in there. Now, my teacher who certified me as a yoga teacher, she's a very traditional classical teacher and from India, born and raised yogi and Ayurvedic practitioner. So already when I did my training with her, she introduced me to Ayurveda. And over the years, I was interested in the matter. And more specifically, in several occasions, I was feeling very much out of balance. I got sick, basically. And I would go and see an Ayurvedic doctor, because I tried the Western doctors and that didn't work out very well. And especially because I'm living in a country where, well, the Western doctors are just basically giving antibiotics for anything that seems to be a symptom with you. So naturally, when you're not doing well and that's all you get, you start to look into alternatives. And so several times when I was ill, I would go and see an Ayurvedic doctor who would treat me, and I would feel amazing afterwards. But I didn't really understand the depth of it. I did, because then later on I would, become sick again or ill again. And it wasn't until I'd done it several times that I started to realize that there was something in the way that I was living that was making me all the time going back into that kind of state of imbalance, let's say. And so when my teacher in yoga put on a certification in Ayurveda, I signed up straight away, because it was the perfect opportunity, just even for me to understand it better. And it really, all the pieces fell into place, which is how I then started to kind of work on Ayurveda in itself. And what's really interesting is that in the Ayurvedic perspective, we all have a constitution with tendencies. And this is what really makes life difficult for us very often, because what's your tendency is basically what we in the West would call our beliefs, right? So basically something that just comes easy to me, and something that really feels like this is me. We're not really consciously thinking it, but it's something that just feels very familiar. And so as I started to look into how people fall out of balance, I realized that there's a part of the modern human that can really benefit from understanding this ancient perspective on how we find balance in life. Because after all, we live in a world which is hugely, tremendously out of balance constantly. So yeah, that's my background.
I think it's really fascinating how everything is interconnected with each other. So, because when we think of psychology, we think of the mind, and when we think of yoga, we think of the body. And these two seem like two separate things, but actually they're so connected and linked together. And I think Ayurveda kind of brings those two together in some kind of way. How would you say, yeah, that Ayurveda is connected to psychology?
Well, because basically, so without making like a whole lecture on what Ayurveda is, if we come from the perspective that Ayurveda is a holistic perspective on the universe, then that means that we basically base ourselves on the idea that everything is interconnected anyway, that everything is energy, and that everything manifests in the physical form through the 5 elements. So in the Vedic philosophies, we would speak about 5 elements, which would be earth, water, fire, air, and then space or ether, right? We used to say ether, and now we speak more about space, which is something that has been completely recognized by the quantum physics, for instance. The idea that there's actually this space that connects everything together. And so if everything is made up by these 5 elements, then it also means that everything can potentially interact and influence each other depending on how the elements act. So from the Ayurvedic perspective, these 5 elements are then, let's say, manifested in their kind of biodynamic form in what's called 3 doshas or 3 bioenergies. And everything in the world, and us as well, have a constitution of these 3 bioenergies, but at different ratios, which means that the external environment will affect us, will affect the ratio of these elements inside of us. And when we get to understand how the interplay is, that's how we can adjust ourselves to the external environment. Now, that is very simple, and we all have done it for a very, very long time. Just as a simple thing, all the kind of grandmother's recipes for illnesses before we started to pop pills, let's say, are all very much actually coming from this. Like things like having warm milk in order to help you sleep is something that's not necessarily in the West, our grandmothers would do that, but they didn't learn it from Ayurveda. So that was actually something that they knew anyway. Or the fact of having like warm water with lemon and ginger when we have a cold, for instance, right? Because what we realized was that by changing the environment inside of me when there's something that's not right, by adding something or reducing something, I'm bringing myself back into homeostasis, which is basically the medical term for saying balance inside of the body. Now, how does these imbalances happen then? Well, that's where the psychology part comes in, because actually, so if we then look at the world from the Ayurvedic perspective, that everything is interrelated and everything starts with the energy, then we also have an energetic part of us. So there's like this energetic body, if you will, right? And imbalances starts in the most subtle form, which is actually then in the energetic form. So when we begin to notice from an Ayurvedic perspective that there's changes on a more mood level, if you will, how we're feeling, how our mind is, then we start to notice that there is an imbalance that is beginning to happen in the rest of the body. The difficulty in the world that we live in today is that we've become so familiarized with these mental, energetic imbalances. And then what we've tried to do instead is that we find these crutches in order to compensate for those imbalances from something outside, instead of actually taking care of the internal imbalance. And I'm speaking, of course, of things like just, tired. Like it's as if that's the biggest pandemic that we've had for quite a while. Everyone is constantly tired and chronically tired, and everyone's very often overdoing it. Dehydration is also a really important part of it that we don't notice because we don't know that it's dehydration. And it would be really easy to attend to if we realized in the beginning that it's dehydration. And what we tend to do is that we dehydrate ourselves even more instead of actually trying to hydrate ourselves. So we can see some of the very typical diseases, the chronic diseases that we see in the world today, that can be absolutely dealt with if we would start on the energetic level. So already start on the mental level, for instance, and the emotional level, as soon as we notice imbalances. Now, the issue, of course, is I mentioned earlier on there that we have these, what we call the tendencies. So each and one of these 3 bioenergies that we have inside of us, they therefore then bring characteristics to us on the physical level, but also then naturally on the mental and the emotional level, because it's all interrelated, right? So that means that if you have a dominant in a very fiery kind of element, you will have a tendency to always do more, to push more, and to be very fiery as a person. Now, because that then feels very familiar to you, because that is who you are, so tapping into this idea about the beliefs of our personality, then it can be really difficult to see yourself from the outside and say, oh, I'm actually overdoing it, because we just take that for granted that this is who I am, right? And so this is also where it can become very interesting when we come in from the Western perspective and look at it, because today we live in such a, I want to say such a screwed world, like such a almost perverted perception of what we're supposed to be, that some of these ancient practices feels disconnected for us. So there's a lot of shame and guilt that are very prominent in the way that we act today. Like they're the underlying intentions behind a lot of things in our behaviors. That wasn't something really maybe that they had to deal with in the same way 5,000 years ago when we trace back the first texts in Ayurveda. And so sometimes you need someone with the understanding of the Western perspective to come in and to speak to people where they are at, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think it's fascinating how Ayurveda is such an old practice, like an ancient practice, and it has so many tools and things that we can learn from, but we've completely forgotten about in the Western culture, and we've become separated from. So relearning those again is a task, but it's really, like you said, it's so important. And also it's important to have someone that understands the psychology as well. So you're bringing in the Western world with the Eastern world, and for the modern day person really, so they can apply that into their lives. So, and I also think it's really interesting that you were talking about the subtle body. And I think, do you think that how we feel, our body reflects how we feel? So if we have any symptoms or disease in our body, it's a reflection of what is happening in our mind or energetic body.
Yes, absolutely. I would say that it starts actually on the more subtle level. So it starts more in the mind. Then so what we have to think is it starts on the energetic level. So it starts in the mind, it starts in how we're feeling, right? And then if we don't pay attention to that, then that's going to descend into the manifested part. And then it usually goes, first of all, into the digestive system, which is also very common. We see all these people, having issues with digestion, right? One way or another. And that is also something that even as a Westerner, without knowing anything about Ayurveda, many people can feel and know how when they're worried about something, when they're stressed about something, they can feel like a knot in the stomach, right? In the stomach. And there can be bloating and constipation, or on the contrary, like diarrhea, due to something that's going on in their life that is affecting them mentally. So it starts in the mental, and then we start to notice in the gut that we're not taking care of what's going on in the mental. So if we don't deal with what's going on in the more subtle, it will absolutely descend, because at some point it's going to actually just fester inside of us, just like any disease that is not taken care of.
Mm-hmm. I actually heard someone say that we have two brains, like our mind and our stomach.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because I think it's very intuitive, and but we don't listen. So.
Yeah, and so it's very interesting you say that, because, well, yes, I agree. And, you know, they say that we have, now don't quote me on this because I'm not 100% sure, but we have like even more neurons in the stomach than we have in the brain or something like that. But at least we have, yes, we have an enormous amount of neurons in our stomach. And the thing is, what's really hard is that we are not intuitive, because we haven't really learned how to be. And so this is what you see as well sometimes when people try to be intuitive, but without actually doing the work. And that's how they end up. I don't know if you've heard about this. I heard about it recently, actually, this thing, like this diet that they would just call like intuitive eating.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem with that is that unless you are actually very well in balance already, and that you're very much in tune with your body, naturally there will be plenty of moments where you feel like, well, yeah, but I'm craving chocolate, or I'm craving sugar, or I'm craving salt. And it's like, well, actually, maybe what you're craving is water. Maybe you're actually dehydrated. Maybe what you're craving is actually rest, right? And so we interpret that differently. So yes, we should be more intuitive, because we can be, because of course that's like any animal is, but we've disconnected from it. So our interpretation of it is not always correct.
Yeah. So it's good to listen to yourself and your body and your intuition, but at the same time, you have to understand where that's coming from and the root cause of that, because otherwise you could be thinking, I want sugar, when actually you need something completely different. Yeah, that's really interesting, actually. So I just want to talk about the doshas a bit as well. Can you just generally describe the doshas? So if people are listening, maybe they can think they fit into one of these.
Yes, absolutely. With pleasure. People always find that very interesting. So basically the three doshas are Vata, Pitta, and Kapha. Okay. And so they go from most subtle to most gross. So Vata is the combination of air and space, which means that as a characteristic, sorry, I don't know if you hear the planes. The characteristics of the Vata dosha is that it's very light, it's dry, and it's always in action. So it's movement, right? Then we have the dosha in the middle, which is the Pitta. And Pitta is fire with a little bit of water. And that brings characteristics that are very much of the fire element, of course, but then with that added water, it also makes it a little bit sticky. So what that does is that it's still light and quite in movement like air, but the difference is that it's hot. It's really hot, and therefore also transformative, right? So it's transformation and assimilation, just like fire is. And then the third dosha is called Kapha, and that's the combination of earth and water. And so earth and water together, then it's really the opposite of the other two, and especially of Vata, because it's heavy and dense, and it's stagnant or stable, you could say as well, and it's cold. So basically, when we combine earth and water, right, it's goo, right? It's mud. Now, it used to be said that every person is one of the three. And I think that depending on different things, that view has a little bit been refined. So often today we can speak about that you have one of them that's dominant, but there can also be absolutely one that two of them are quite dominant and they really interplay with each other. So if I would be really general in order for people to kind of get the idea of it, if we would just speak of people who are like one dosha, the typical vata kind of person, we see in their features that are linked then to air. So it's usually people who are quite thin in their structure, like originally. It doesn't mean that they can't put on weight, but originally, okay? And they're usually either very tall or really quite small. And they have thin limbs and things like that. You would also see like they have usually quite thin faces and quite thin eyes. And you can also see that, for instance, their skin is quite dry, or it becomes dry easy, can be like an issue for them quickly. Their hair is also quite fine, thin and dry. So we can see in some parts of the world where this is quite common, with, for instance, in Northern Europe, where we have a lot of quite thin blonde, for instance, that doesn't mean that it can't go thick, but the hairs itself is really thin compared to, well, let's say typically in India, where the hairs are really thick for many people. Like, so you can see that difference there. So that's really like the vata dosha that you see represented in these people. And when it comes to how their personality is, they are very often very conceptual. So we have to think about this like really kind of soft and creative on a conceptual level, not necessarily in the hands. And it's also the people who are the closest actually to living in a very spiritual kind of enlightened way, if they want to, because they're so thin in their constitution themselves, but they can very, very easily go out of balance. Okay, because they're so thin and quite fragile, it's also the people who more easily become sick. And when we look at the vata kind of people, the pitta kind of people, this is the kind of in between the two. So they're always kind of like in moderation. So when it comes to how their body is built up, they will be quite thin in the frame as well, but not at all as fragile as the vata. They will have quite a strong muscle mass. And so there's someone who can be easily transforming their muscles into like a really strong body. The pitta dosha is very much linked to the yang energy, so the quite male energy. Right? Men in general have often quite a lot of pitta in them. And you will also see that they will have a little bit more of the features of the water. So they will have a little bit more of a shade of glow in their skin, for instance, not as much as a kapha, for instance, but they will have everything that's a little bit more in between, if you see what I mean. So if the vata, for instance, they have very thin eyes, well, the pitta, they have a little bit bigger eyes, but they will also have this sharpness in their eyes because of that fire element. So they will be people who, when they look into your eyes, you will have a little bit that feeling as if they're looking straight into your soul, you know, or like straight through you. Right? And they will also, on the personality, be people who can be extremely charismatic, right? And they're good leaders. But also, of course, if this goes out of balance, which naturally can happen, it would also be then the tendency towards kind of like jealousy and manipulation, right? So this is something that we can actually see in the political world quite a lot, right? Very charismatic people who manage to get the crowds with them. But then they get, their ego, their fire becomes so strong. So then it goes into like the negative side of it, if you will.
Yeah, about balancing the ego, I think.
Yeah. And then finally for the kapha kind. So kapha then, it's really the opposite to the vata. So here we are really in a constitution that's super stable. So their bones are like big boned and they're very stable. Like for me, it makes me think of like your typical farmer, who's like really close to nature, always in the same mood. They sometimes have these like really big hands as well. And it's just like these like people that you make make you feel safe. And they usually they never get wrinkles really. They have a really oily skin. They can even have a tendency to develop like issues with that. They have often very big eyes that are very kind. And you will also see them quite drawn to any kind of social work. So taking care of people, nurturing. So a lot of nurses who found their place in the world can often relate a little bit to this kind of state. And if they would go out of balance, what's really difficult for a Kapha person is that because they're so stable, if they go out of balance, they have this tendency for stagnation, right? And then it's really hard to get them moving. And that's when we would see people going into like obesity, for instance, and depression and losing confidence in themselves. So now I'm being extremely general, of course, in my kind of explanation of the three, but that's kind of to see what they look like and also be able to see like, oh, I think I have a little bit of this and a little bit of that. Yeah.
I find this so fascinating because it ties everything together, our bodies, and you can really visualize these types as well. I remember doing my yoga teacher training, we did our Ayurvedic part, and yeah, and they had the pictures and everything of like all the body types, and it's really good to be able to visualize each dosha, I think, but also listening to you talk about them, it makes me realize, yeah, when we are out of balance, it makes complete and utter sense. And I really love the way it ties everything together, like, yeah, our body, our moods, the way we react as well. Yeah, I think it's really, really interesting. And obviously you can talk more about this in depth if people want to contact you directly. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So thank you for talking to me today, Charlotte. I know this was like short and sweet. So if people want to contact you, how do they get in contact with you? What's the best way?
So people can contact me either through on social media, through my Instagram, where I'm easily accessible at yogisha. Just yogisha, sorry. And then the website is yogisha.com. So it's all kind of in the same logic. And yeah, so they can contact me that way, or even just email me at charlotte@yogisha.com. So all in the same logic. Yeah, and I work with people both in group dynamics online and also in individual programs as well. And then, yeah, so.
I think it's so important because obviously the past 2 years, we've had this crisis going on, and I think it's brought a lot of people back to these principles, back to these ancient principles, and realizing how important and how much they work as well. Like, I think the realization that these are, it's not just a phase, it's not just a trend, these are ancient principles that have worked for thousands, millions of years.
Exactly. I think, I think you're so right in what you're saying. And I think that, first of all, it's the fact that it's the experience that speaks, right? So for thousands of years, this has been working, and they haven't changed the way they do it, as opposed to new trends that comes on now and then they change their minds and all of that. And then, just like you were saying, these past 2 years, I think that one of the things that we've realized is just how fragile we are, number one. And then also that there's a lot of distrust, because we also realize that maybe things aren't actually always what we've been told that they are. And so there's financial interest behind things. And so when we then start to open ourselves up to the ancient practices that haven't been put in the spotlight because there's no financial interest behind them, then all of a sudden it feels more safe to trust that. And I would love if this whole pandemic would have brought people closer back to actually looking into their own bodies, their intuition, and how the ancient practices can heal them instead.
Yeah, I think it has, but at the same time, there's only Not everybody, let's say.
Of course.
Yeah, I think, yeah, it's so important. And yeah, I hope that everybody kind of realizes this, maybe not like fully, but like just a little bit, you know, taking like a little bit of knowledge away from this, or yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining me, Charlotte.
Thank you very much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Yeah. And yeah, thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you, you too.